Yeah, let's discuss some matters pertaining to the Gospel of Matthew at this time. So bringing in our PowerPoints, a couple of items, including our introductory matters, the canonical Gospels. Gospel of Matthew, written after the Gospel of Luke, most likely, especially given that some time for the community in Antioch to develop. We believe it was written to Antioch in Syria, Antioch near the Orontes. Some people would say Jerusalem, but it fits better in that setting. Syria at the time had a large Jewish population. We also have some other Jewish writings that come from there. People fled there after the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple, a large rabbinic presence. And we find that it's aimed at Christians who come from a Jewish background. So the gospel emphasizes Jesus as the Redeemer, Jesus as the Messiah, and kind of plays off this theme as Jesus being the new Moses, part of the old part of the story. So in terms of introductory material then, that date there between 80 and 90, of course, Matthew also had access to the Gospel of Mark and the same source Q. Authorship, well, traditionally Matthew, we don't necessarily know. So consult your textbook there for that discussion. So written to people with a Jewish background. Jesus is also presented as like the true interpreter of the law of Torah and as the fulfillment of the Old Testament story leading up, Old Testament prophecy. So some interesting characteristics. We've talked about characteristics of Mark and Luke. For Matthew, it's very interesting that there is a Semitic touch to some of Matthew's Greek. So when Matthew writes the gospel in Greek, you can kind of tell that it's somebody that is from Jewish background. Of course, the spoken language was Aramaic. It's kind of like listening to a commentator on your video here that speaks English, but certainly is from Dutch descent. And so you can kind of hear that, read that in the language too. So you can kind of tell. Also, you can really tell that the person has a Jewish audience in mind. It's not explaining as many Jewish traditions and holidays and all that. And you can tell that it's presenting the story of Jesus as something that should go beyond the current community of that church there. Something that's interesting is even though the story is presented as the fulfillment, as Jesus as the fulfillment from Old Testament prophecy, there's one part there in the birth narrative where it says after they have moved on from Jerusalem, it says there he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. And actually, we cannot find this particular Old Testament prophecy in the Old Testament. Is it an Old Testament prophecy? So that's kind of just a little bit of trivia for you here. What do you do with that? Is this something that was an oral tradition? Is this something that was in the Old Testament, but it did not survive? We will one day find that. We have some other things, right? In the Old Testament, it mentions like the Book of Jubilee, some of the King's Annals. In the New Testament, we also miss some things. Is that it? Is this a different sort of tradition? So I'll leave you to it. Doesn't keep me up at night. It's just very interesting, right? The book of Matthew is known specifically, or perhaps for mostly, for a famous sermon of Jesus that is recorded here, Sermon on the Mount. It spans over 3 chapters, chapters 5 through 7. Luke actually also records it. Some things a little bit reworded. We call it the Sermon on the Plain, but we mostly know it from Matthew. It would have been given here in this picture, this particular spot, overlooking maybe the Sea of Galilee. In the story, that's where it's at. So mount, hill, very famous. It starts out with what we call the Beatitudes, but it actually goes on. So on the left side, you see Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And it just goes on. Blessed are you with your hunger and thirst for righteousness. And so you can read that and see on the left side that Jesus says, this is the kind of people that I look for in a restored community. If you're like that, you're blessed. It will look like this. You know, you will hunger and thirst. You will have mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And so, I memean, that's a beautiful sermon. But on the other side, you will see way down in the book that it's balanced. It's kind of like bookends. Because in chapter 23, Jesus actually lashes out to a bunch of religious leaders who do not embody these ideals of the community that Jesus came to restore. So when Jesus gives that Sermon on the Mount, on that hill, the people who come really want to hear from Jesus. I mean, at some point, they just got to feed them because these people are away from their homes. When he gets to chapter 23, he's around people that they do not want to have Jesus. It's toward the end of his life. They're tired of him. They don't like how he challenges the religious traditions. You know, people don't mind religion as long as it can be put in their way, but they don't like somebody who wants to upset the status quo for the sake of the people. People like systems, just not care and love for people. And so Jesus is completely tired of that. And so he actually lashes out. And the way that Matthew presents this, he says, look, it's kind of opposite of what Jesus started out with at the beginning of his sermon. He says, rather than saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for there's the kingdom of God, he tells them, shame on you, you Pharisees, you religious leaders. You lock people out of this ideal community. You lock them out of the kingdom of heaven. He says, and rather than just hungering for and hunger and thirsting for the good stuff, for righteousness, you just look righteous on the outside, but inside, you're just a bag of dead bones. He says, you neglect mercy. He says, you do all these little rules. You like bring tithes and offerings of itty bitty little spices, but you're just full of it. He says, you're not pure in heart. There's all sorts of filth. Here's something. This is not me. This is Jesus saying it, right? He says, they shall be called children of God. He says, you will be called twice a child of Hades, a child of hell. So Jesus is not a pushover. Jesus tells the people what he really thinks. He says, it's honorable to do this. It's shameful to do that. And we cannot have a restored community unless you're with the former. So I think it's good to know where you find that sermon of Jesus. At one point, we see this in other Gospels as well. Jesus takes his disciples all the way up north, geographically speaking, all the way to the top part of Israel. He takes them to a place called Banias or Caesarea Philippi. They were always renaming stuff. And this is actually, ironically, right, for this Gospel, this is actually a very non-Jewish environment. It's very pagan, it's very Roman. You see these grottos here. You see these little places carved out. This is where they would have statues standing there. This is actually a grotto that they associated with worship of Hades. And this is the part where Jesus turns to them and says, well, who do the people say that the Son of Man is? And they say, well, some say you're John the Baptist, who at that point has been killed. Some say maybe you're some returning Old Testament person like Elijah or Jeremiah, or one of the prophets, like you're back alive. And then Jesus turns the question to them and he says, well, who do you all, it's a plural, who do you all say that I am? Maybe it's Peter, but he says, who do you say that I am? And the question kind of comes to the person. And notice in the mountains, even today, you can see that when he asks that, he's asking them the question about, have you figured out who I am? And what do you tell the people about me? In front of this whole pagan scene. And this gospel is written down for these Jewish churches, right? That's very interesting. I'm thinking, if you want to have like a grand disclosure of who Jesus is, wouldn't you do it in this massive religious site, like do it like at the temple in Jerusalem or something? But no, Jesus breaks through all those cultural bonds. And so Simon Peter actually says, I know. And he says, you're the Messiah. You're the one that we've been waiting for, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, wow, that's very good. Blessed are you, Simon. And he tells him his descendants, son of Jonah. For this is not some earthly stuff. Flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven has revealed this. And I tell you, you are Peter. And he gives him kind of like a wordplay. And on this rock, because your name means rock, I will build my church upon you saying this. I will form my ideal community based on you. And the gates of Hades will not stand against it. Well, that's not just a phrase. When they're standing there and you look over here, This was actually the grotto of Hades. They believed it was the entrance into the netherworld, not the Netherlands, but the netherworld, where Hades resided. There was water in there, and they thought it was the entrance of that gate of hell. And he said, don't be afraid of these kind of gods. They cannot damage that. That's pretty cool. Jesus told all sorts of parables, and we will look at parables. It's interesting how he aimed these parables at the particular communities to whom it was written, right? God meets people where they are. And so in Matthew, he tells the story of the laborers in the vineyards. People would have seasonal workers that help with harvest in vineyards. Here's that, you can see that here. Here's that vineyard right there. And so when it comes time to harvest what's in the vineyard, there's always like the manager who goes out to the town center and picks up some workers. And Matthew has a very interesting story where starting out, it's kind of like unusual, right? This is not really how it goes, but that's the whole point to get your attention. Where starting early in the morning, every hour or so, this manager goes downtown and gets more workers to come in. And the kicker is every time he negotiates a price for which they will work, and it's always the same price. But at the end of the day, when the work is done, even though everybody agreed to the price and they all get that salary, they figure out from one another that some of them have worked longer, some of them have worked shorter, and they all got the same price. Well, they're okay with it as long as they don't know it from one another. But once they figure out that the other people have worked longer, they're like, whoa, what's going on? It's kind of like, my mom, when the kids were little, they liked their bowl with cereal with marshmallows in it, and they liked it. But if they sat next to each other and the other kid had more marshmallows in it, they're like, whoa, there's more marshmallows, no fair, right? And the point here is that Jesus says the first will be last and the last will be first, is, he's dealing with this Jewish community, and they have endured hardship for centuries, really, really tough. But now the community, the restored community, is open for everyone. Non-Jewish people, the Gentiles, can come in way easier. And it's kind of like, you mean we get the same result, even though we've suffered for centuries? Is that grace? Like death, bad conversion sort of thing? So that's very challenging, that story. Jesus tells more stories, and it's all very Jewish. Jewish people are very much so very direct. I come from a Jewish family, and my grandma was always very direct. She'd say, that shirt doesn't look good on you. Just kind of tell you that. And I was like, okay, So the parables are very much in your face. It tells a story about the sheep and the goats. And he says, here's how a sheep behaves in the community. Here's how a goat behaves in the community. And we don't like the goats. So in the end, God will say, well, you're a goat, you're a sheep. And he just tells this story. Ends this presentation. It ends with the words of Jesus where he says, now I want you all in this church here. I want you all to go into the whole empire, into the whole world. And I want you to make more students of this story. And I want you to baptize them, which means I want you to bring them into the community. I want you to bring them into the community with a welcoming ritual where you baptize them, which is very public, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And then I want you to tell them all these things that I commanded you. And then it looks like there's kind of like an afterthought phrase. Remember, I'm with you always to the end of the age. But that's actually a bombshell, because remember, kind of like when we were at Caesarea Philippi and looking at the grotto of Hades, the people believed that gods were localized, that there was a god over the mountain and a god over the grotto and a god over the waters, and they kind of never moved. Right? There's a story in the Old Testament where there's this prophet Jonah who thinks you can run from God. And we're like, you cannot run from God. Well, they really thought you could run from God because God will stay on the land. And when you go into the water, there's another God. But now Jesus says, no. The God of Israel doesn't just stay in Israel. God is everywhere. So I'm with you always, at all times, everywhere. This is mind-blowing. You can leave your community and go around, and God is present everywhere. He's not landlocked, and there's challenges to go. And that are the points of Matthew.